Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our How to Develop and Write an Effective Third-Party Risk Management Policy Document webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials. Answer all 3 of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will be sending the link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 5 to 7 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will walk you through the fundamentals of third-party risk management policy creation and share some best practices for creating a solid policy for your organization. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about the downloadable resources we have provided in the Related Content widget. We have our third-party risk management regulatory guidance document, our third-party risk management policy template, and last, our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit. Hillary will discuss why these tools are helpful and relevant during today's webinar. Again, those resources are available in the Related Content widget. With that, Hillary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessie. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's discussion is all about policies, and so we're going to start right off with talking about regulatory requirements and how you should reflect them in your policies if you're in a regulated industry. We're also going to talk about the recommended content and flow of a third-party risk management policy, what should go into it, and we'll focus a lot on incorporating the third-party risk management life cycle and those various activities into your document, as well as how to get your policy approved and how to maintain it. We'll wrap up the day with some key takeaways, so let's jump right in. Okay, while this sounds really basic, let's start with what a third-party risk management policy actually is. It is essentially the formal governance document that is going to outline all of the guidelines and practices to be followed in your organization to manage those risks that come with your third-party relationships. The policy also defines roles and responsibilities to make sure that third-party risk management processes and practices are executed effectively and that they have the right governance and oversight. So before we go about writing the policy, there's a few things to consider first. And that's really in relation to the organization's policy requirements and standards, right? So when we're thinking about this, we might want to think if there's a specific template or format we need to follow. If there is, we need to start with that because trying to reformat another template is just going to be a waste of time. We need to know who owns the policy and who should be involved in the review and, who should advise on the policy, right? Which stakeholders should be involved. We want to know how policies are developed and distributed and maintained. So, who approves that policy? In most organizations and for best practices, that should be the board of directors, but maybe that doesn't apply. In your organization, it just might be the most senior level of management or even the risk committee. We also want to know how policies are enforced at the organization. That's going to be a really important part of having an effective policy, is that there's an effective enforcement method. We also want to know if there's any exceptions that are allowed, and if so, how are they requested, how are they approved, and how are they documented. And then we want to know, what are the triggers to update our policy? Is that an annual review? Is that a change in regulatory guidance? All of these things are really important to think about before you get started. All right, first off, in terms of content, it's really important to only include the rules and requirements for third-party risk management and not any processes or procedures in your policy, because the policy is only meant to convey those requirements. It's not meant to instruct stakeholders on how to achieve those processes. So your policies need to be concise, but they also need to communicate all the necessary requirements. So don't get hung up on page count. We're taking as much space as we need to clearly communicate. We also want to make sure that policies are only containing the information that's relevant to all stakeholders. They should address third-party risk management at the enterprise level. And if a particular group or business unit has different rules and requirements, they should not be included in the overall policy, but instead they could be addressed as a supplement or a related policy. Another really important thing to remember when writing your policy is to use active and direct words. You know, we see a lot of policies that use the word shall, and even though that's commonplace, I think it's more effective to always be clear about what you mean. So if it's requirement, use the word must. If it's prohibited, use the words must not. You could potentially say may for any action that's discretionary, or should for things that are recommended but not required. One of the most important things to remember about your policy is that it reflects your actual practices. Writing policies from an aspirational point of view is not recommended, because your auditors and regulators expect you do what you say you do. So if your policy is drastically different from the environment in which stakeholders operate, it's also going to be really hard for them to adhere to it. You cannot enforce policies that are not relevant to your current practices. So your policy should state exactly what you're doing today, not what you hope to do someday or what you think you should do. A good rule of thumb is to omit any requirement that you can't prove you do, right? So when in doubt, leave it out. If you are in a regulated industry, it is essential for you to locate, read, and understand the guidance related to third-party risk management that applies to your organization. We want to do this because it's going to really help us create a policy that reflects our current state versus the aspirational one, so we can sort of separate what it is we do versus what we should do. We also want to make sure that our policy is reflecting that regulatory guidance. It's including the same types of requirements and recommendations. We also will use that guidance to help us improve or maintain our compliance. So if we've identified gaps that we're not doing, we can put together work plans to address that. And if your guidance is subject to regulatory requirements, it's a really great idea to actually list the specific guidance in your policy. So we have an example of that in the policy template. So what if you're not in a regulated industry? Well, I would suggest you still read and at least become familiar with some of this regulatory guidance. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because regulatory guidance has long shaped and influences what we consider best practices for third-party risk management today. Another reason is related to our customers. We may not be regulated, but our customers may be. So it's important to understand those requirements, activities, et cetera, so that we can reflect those in our policies and practices, but also increase our customers' confidence in what we're doing around third-party risk management. Now, while you are absorbing that information, let's go to our first poll. Jesse?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, what motivated you to participate in today's webinar? I am creating a new third-party risk management policy. I'm updating an existing third-party risk management policy. I'm generally interested in the topic. I need it for CPE credits or other. Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Okay, let's do it.
Do the regulations state that you have to have a vendor management policy, or is that a best practice?
Okay, so the first thing is it does depend on the regulation. Now, what it looks like for most of them is very few of them actually say you have to have a policy. They're just assuming that you do. And they're mentioning the policy in multiple areas, for example, that the board should oversee and approve the policy. So yes, it is a regulatory requirement for most regulated industries, and at the very least, it is a best practice. Remember, your policy is there to formalize and communicate the rules and requirements for third-party risk management at your organization. So it's really important to have one. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a quick reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our third-party risk management regulatory guidance document available for download.
Okay, now it's time to think about the content and information flow of your policy. Now again, I'm going to be giving you best practices, recommendations, but your policy always has to reflect the unique needs and requirements that you have at your organization. So as a general best practice, we need to cover 3 major components in our policy. The first one is general information, right? This includes the background and purpose of the policy, our scope, governance and oversight, responsibilities of the stakeholders, and general documentation and reporting. We also want to have a section that specifically addresses our risk management practices. So what are the specific requirements and activities, and how do they align with the third-party risk management lifecycle? And then generally we're going to have another section that's kind of all other related information. This could be your issue management processes, your exceptions and escalations, descriptions of systems and tools, any related policy, and your policy change management log. All right, let's talk about some general information. Now again, all policies are not going to look exactly the same, but they should share some common elements. And some of the most important information should come right at the beginning of your policy. So that's your overview, your policy statement, and your policy purpose. Let's walk through these. That overview is really stating the risks that you're addressing. In this case, we're saying the organization has the resilience in third-party relationships. They're risky, but we depend on them for our operations. So right there, we've sort of said, this is the situation. Now we're going to the policy statement. And you've maybe heard me say before that this policy statement is more or less the elevator speech for your policy. We only have a very short time to get our point across. And in this case, we're saying that the organization's use of third parties does not diminish our responsibility to manage the risk, right? That is super straightforward, and literally anyone can understand that statement. Then we get to the purpose of the policy. So this is where we're stating how having the policy helps us address the risk. In this example, we're saying that the policy provides the rules, guidelines, and outlines the structure for how we manage third-party risk. So right there, 3 simple paragraphs, we describe the risk we're addressing, why it's important to address the risk, and how the policy helps us do that. So yeah, why are these paragraphs such a big deal? Well, mostly because a lot of people don't actually read the full policy. So we're trying to get that most important information across right in the beginning. And who knows, they may sink in, compel people to read the rest of the policy. So lots more about this in the template and companion guide, but let's continue. All right. It is important to define some key terms in your policy. At the very least, you should be defining what a third party or vendor is and what third party or vendor risk management is. Now, I've given some examples. I'm not going to read them for you, but keep in mind that this is not a glossary. We're not defining every single term in the policy. You can have one if you choose to at the back of the policy. But for this, we're just trying to help everyone understand what we mean by third party and what we mean by third party risk management. It's also important to define the scope of your policy. So we need to identify the types of third party relationships that are covered under this policy. So again, back to that most restrictive regulatory guidance, that interagency guidance, they say that all business relationships except for customers are included in third-party risk management. However, as is the case in a lot of organizations, some of those relationships might be covered under other policies, such as those involving contracted employees, which would be covered under your HR policies. Other things to think about are things like public utilities, might be excluded from your program, as would be emergency services or government authorities. Those are generally not included. The decision to exclude certain types of relationships is going to depend on your organization and regulatory requirements. But no matter what, it's important to clearly spell out which relationships are covered and which are not. Another important information is who is subject to the policy, so who has to adhere to these requirements. In most cases, that is going to be everyone working for or on behalf of your organization, including your contractors, consultants, and some third parties. Now, your policy should generally describe your governance and oversight, including who approves the policy or if there's any specific approvals required for critical third parties. We'll also want to talk about how decisions are made about third-party risk, how we track, report, and manage third-party risk management issues. We want to include the type of reporting and the frequency of that reporting to the board. And of course, we need to have defined and documented third-party risk management roles and responsibilities, which we're going to look at the next slide. Keep in mind, we're thinking about a practical overview. We don't need to detail how our risk management committee is structured, for example. Now, it is important to list out and detail roles and responsibilities as they pertain to third-party risk management. There's some excellent examples of this in the policy companion guide. So we want to make sure, first of all, that the policy is accurately reflecting the titles that apply in your organization. So, for example, if you don't have sourcing or procurement, don't include it in your policy. You might call the individuals who have day-to-day relationships with your vendors by a different name. Maybe you don't call them vendor owners in your organization. That's fine. Just make sure that the policy language matches their actual titles. Now, the titles listed here are the most common. We want to talk about board of directors, management, the lines of business or business units. Within those, we usually have that third-party relationship owner or vendor owner, the specific third-party risk management team. If there's others like sourcing, procurement, or supply chain management, we'll want to address that. Legal, subject matter experts, and that of internal audit. Now, it is important to use the accurate titles and descriptions for your organization, and keep in mind that if you do have some big reorg in the future where all the role titles are changed, yes, your policy will need to be updated. So because documentation and reporting are so fundamental to any effective third-party risk management program, we should reserve a place in our policy to outline our commitment to retaining important documentation so that it's available for an audit, regulatory exam, legal proceeding, et cetera. We may want to list out the exact types of documents that we retain. There's a list here on the slide. But it's also really important to include some content in your policy that you do report to the board. So, maybe that's on an annual basis, a quarterly basis. You do want to include a statement about reporting to the board if, in fact, you do that. All right, so once you've covered your more general information, we start coming to the part of the policy where we really start defining those requirements for third-party risk management at the organization. And we're going to start with a general overview that speaks to the basic elements of third-party risk management, followed by more detailed sections that address each component or each activity. Now, a really great way to do this is to follow the third-party risk management lifecycle. So let's take a look at that now. So here we have the third-party risk management lifecycle, and while most of you are probably familiar with this or some version of this, I really want to emphasize how useful it can be when you're writing your policy. Now, when we look at the lifecycle, we can see that it's broken up into three primary stages. We have that onboarding stage, we have ongoing, and we have offboarding. And within each stage, there are specific activities that follow a specific order. Now, that's because a lot of activities depend on the information or output from an activity that preceded it. So that's why it is important to follow the order. Now, we can use the same order and the same activities to structure individual sections within the policy. Again, I want to emphasize that if you are not completing some of these activities, so for example, maybe you're not doing performance management in your organization, please leave it out. We don't want to represent or speak to activities and requirements that we can't satisfy. So now that I've reminded you of that, let's review the first activity of planning and risk assessment. Now, one question I get asked a lot is, should I structure my policy to follow the order of the life cycle in terms of stages, or should I, for example, talk about all the types of risk assessment together? Honestly, that's going to be up to you and your organization. Some organizations like to follow the progression of the life cycle, while others are going to group by types of activities, such as all risk assessments in one section. And a lot of organizations are going to just follow the order as provided in the regulatory guidance and structure their policy in the same section. In fact, the template that we've provided today really follows and mirrors that interagency guidance and puts the sections in the same order. So whatever method you choose, make sure you're only including those requirements for activities you actually do. Another word of advice here is to think about the output or evidence of these activities and requirements. So let's say you have a requirement around vendor performance monitoring. What type of evidence could you provide to an auditor or regulator to demonstrate that the activity actually takes place and meets the requirements? Would you have scorecards, documented vendor reviews, et cetera? Now, planning is an often overlooked but really important aspect of third-party risk management. So we want to talk about how our organization plans for these relationships. In this example, we've used that they evaluate the nature of the relationship and its complexity and value. We've thought about whether or not it's going to involve foreign third-party activities, if it's going to impact our employees, and if we have sufficient resources and staffing levels to oversee the relationship. Now, whatever you do for your organization is fine. You don't have to be overly detailed. You can give that good overview, but again, make sure that for every requirement, there is a reasonable expectation that you can provide evidence that that activity did occur. Okay, so let's talk about risk assessment, and we're going to spend some time here, do a few slides on risk assessment because it is really the foundation of third-party risk management, and your policy needs to clearly spell out what the requirements are for risk assessments. So first of all, we want to provide an overview that talks about the purpose of risk assessment. This is really important for informing our stakeholders. Then we want to clearly spell out any fixed requirements for risk assessment. So I've provided 2 examples here. The first of which says that we risk assess the inherent risk based on the products and services, and that we're looking at each engagement, not just the relationship. The next requirement says that unless that third-party risk management authorizes it, every engagement has to have an inherent risk rating and a determination whether or not that engagement is critical to the organization. So those are 2 very clear and very common requirements for risk assessment. And speaking of critical, during that risk assessment process, we determine if that engagement is going to be critical. So we need to be very clear what criteria we use or what defines a critical relationship. There's a couple examples here on the slide, again, more in that policy companion, but we want to say this is what constitutes critical and this is what is not critical. We want to spell that out. As a related item, we want to think about the defined levels of risk that we use. So most programs use high, moderate, and low, and they are the baseline rating that's always assigned through an inherent risk assessment to all third-party engagements. Now, we may use the same scale for our residual risk ratings. If that's the case, we want to talk about that. Again, lots more information in the template companion. Now, if you do use residual risk at your organization, and many, many do, we will also want to call out the defined use of residual risk. So I've included some language here that talks very specifically about what inherent risk is and how we determine the residual risk of the engagement after we've applied or considered those controls. And we're saying right here that the residual risk rating is used solely to determine if remaining risks are within our risk appetite and if we need to do more or something else, right? We also want to make sure that people understand that we never use a residual risk rating in place of our inherent risk rating, right? So that should be very clearly called out in your policy. All right, so from there, we're going to move on to due diligence, which is also an incredibly important piece of the process, and we want to make sure that it gets the right attention, content, and detail. Again, lots of examples you can look at the companion guide. But as a rule, we're going to want to give that overview of what due diligence is, why we use it, how we use it. And this next bullet here, which is sometimes overlooked, explicitly states that due diligence is always risk-based, meaning the higher the risk, the more intensive the due diligence will be. Now, I at least want you to put that in terms of your due diligence, but I think overall it's a really great practice to mention that all of your third-party risk management activities are risk-based. All right, back to the third bullet here. This is all about clearly stating that due diligence must be complete before contracts are executed or any work begins. This is a really, really good practice, but if you have no way to monitor it or enforce it, you got to leave it out, right? Another important due diligence requirement is that there is a qualified and documented opinion regarding the sufficiency of the vendor's controls and risk management practices. This really helps the stakeholders understand that their opinion is not going to cut it, that we do have certified, qualified people giving us these qualified opinions, right? So we want to state that in our policy as well. We also want to mention that issues that are discovered during due diligence are tracked, reported, managed, and monitored for timely remediation. Okay, while I've got you thinking about all the stuff you need to put in for due diligence, let's take a little break and go to our next poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, how often do you review and update, if necessary, your third-party risk management policy? every year, every other year or so, as needed, such as a regulatory change, unsure, or we don't have a third-party risk management policy. Hillary, I have another question here from the audience that we can go ahead and answer.
All right.
And this question is, should our policy list specific requirements or just provide an overview of how we manage third-party risk?
You know, that's a really great question. So it is important, because it is a policy, to state specific requirements. So an example might be you have to complete due diligence before you can begin work or execute a contract. That is very clear and specific. It doesn't leave any room for interpretation. So it is important to put specific requirements in there. Another requirement might be that all engagements, all vendor engagements, will be risk rated at the product or service level. Again, you want to be very clear and put those things in your policy. And your policy is also going to have some overviews about how you do things in your governance structure, but make sure you put those clear requirements in there. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Hillary. We have about 20 seconds left on our open poll question, so please submit those responses quickly. Just a reminder, in order to receive the CPE credit, you must answer all of the poll questions that appear on your screen and be in the entire live session today. We will be closing out in just about 5 seconds. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to address the poll. Before we move on, I'd like to remind you that you'll find our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit within the related content widget and available for download. Hillary, back to you.
Okay, so now that you define those risk assessments and due diligence requirements, we don't want to forget that we also need to provide the requirements and details around periodic risk assessments and updated due diligence. So take time to write that quick description and overview of the requirements, and as a best practice, you may want to include some additional language regarding any circumstances that would trigger or require additional risk assessments or more due diligence that is off cycle. So that might be, hey, we do this, once a year for critical and high, but if any of these circumstances occur, then we may do it more frequently. Okay, so those are some examples of information you might want to include. Another really important part of third-party risk management policies are language specific to your contracting process. Now, keep in mind, you may have a completely separate contracting policy, which if that is the case, you definitely want to mention it in that last section. But we also want to make sure that we're detailing the importance of contracts to third-party risk management, right? Because they can be one of our best tools for managing risk. So we want to make sure that we include any requirements that can help us make the most of those contracts. So the first thing we want to do is state right up front that all relationships, all engagements must be documented by a written agreement, right? And that applies to all written agreements, such as purchase orders, scopes of work, and so on. We want to ensure that all stakeholders have a really clear understanding of what constitutes an effective contract. Therefore, we need to make sure that we cover the terms and conditions that are important. For example, it might be critical to us that our contracts include a provision for audit, the right to audit, and that the contract is thoroughly analyzed before it's finalized. If you're looking for specific things in that contract analysis, you're going to want to call them out. Now, the list here is directly from the interagency guidance and is kind of a laundry list of considerations, terms, and conditions that need to be reasonably representative in your written agreements. Now, from a practical standpoint, it's unlikely that you're going to have this level of analysis on each and every single agreement, especially if you have thousands of third parties. So you may want to add language saying that this list is specific to high risk or critical and the other types of contracts are at the discretion of third-party risk management and legal, whatever the case may be for your organization. Okay, some additional things we like to recommend that you put in your contracting section would be pertaining to contract management, and does that involve potentially like a midpoint contract review? What is the process for contract termination, right? So is there a need for a review or authorization from the legal team, and who would be responsible for writing the formal notice of termination? And we also want to include specific language in the contract section outlining any actions that will be taken in case third parties fail to meet the conditions of the contract. Now we want to have a section that addresses ongoing monitoring, and you can break this section out specifically to address risk monitoring versus performance monitoring, but here are the recommended sections you might want to include. So we want to review what we mean by monitoring so that we're clear, and it's important to note that monitoring activities should be risk-based, again. We also want to provide that overview of the activities that fall under the monitoring umbrella, and as a best practice, organizations should implement enhanced monitoring for critical or high-risk third parties. So if that's the case, make sure to highlight it and provide the relevant details. Additionally, we're going to need to clearly outline the kind of corrective actions that we take when we identify emerging risk or failed performance. So while we've included issue management here as a subsection under monitoring, some organizations choose to make it its own section. That's perfectly fine as long as your policy covers issue management. It's really important to include that. All right, so one section that I see left out of policies all the time is the termination section. I really want everyone to seriously think about including this section if you don't have it already, because there is so much operational, legal, compliance, financial risk, et cetera, that can be tied up in poorly executed vendor terminations. So we do want to have a section in our policy. We want to have that overview, and we want to talk about the conditions that might result in a terminated relationship, whether that's end of contract, poor performance, breach of contract, et cetera. We do want to list if there's any specific approvals that are required to terminate a contract. So maybe for critical and high risk, it has to have a legal and managerial review. We also want to know if there are going to be requirements around having documented exit plans. Again, these are the ways that we are going to safely and soundly exit that relationship, that communicate all of the roles and responsibilities for both parties, our communication plans, stakeholders, et cetera. So maybe for high risk and critical, we require a documented exit plan. We also need to think about, when we end those relationships with our third parties, all the administrative obligations we have here. So this includes reviewing and approving the final invoice, updating all our relevant systems of records, but we also want to make sure we're clearly call out who's responsible for those activities to make sure that they're executed correctly. And then last but not least, we want to put information in there, because this is crucial, that the proper organization and storage of third-party records is a requirement, and we want to identify who's responsible for it. Okay, so it's obvious that not everything we want to cover in the policy is going to fit neatly into that first section, that general information section, or align to the life cycle. So it's fine for us to address additional issues or concerns in their own separate sections. So some common areas that we might see included are those around issue management, right? Maybe reporting is its own section, and any guidelines for policy exceptions, right? And if they're allowed, are approvals necessary? Now, this next thing is mandatory third-party risk management policy complaints, and I want everyone to hear me really clearly. So in some organizations, there's always some boilerplate language about how employees must comply with the policy and the potential penalties if they do not, like up to and including termination. A word of advice here, right? Do not take it upon yourself to start adding language about how folks are going to be punished or terminated without running it by your HR team. We want to make sure that the policy, first of all, is consistent with your organization's standards of policy enforcement and that it doesn't potentially violate any employment laws. So I need everyone to pay attention to that. Along those same lines, if there's requirements for specific employees to have third-party risk management training or certifications, that can be listed in your policy as well. We also should look at other related information. So what about a description of the systems and tools used to facilitate, execute, manage, and monitor third-party risk management? So you might say our system of record is our third-party risk management system, blah, blah, or contracts are captured and managed through this system. We definitely always want to include a list of related policies, but we want to use hyperlinks. And the reason for that is that we don't want to copy relevant sections of applicable policies or related policies within our own policy. One, because it's going to make it too long, and two, that gives us a whole other set of content to manage and constantly review, right? So just list the related policies and the hyperlink to the current policy. And then we also, in every policy, we want to keep a policy management and change log that keeps track of the different versions, material changes that were made, when it was approved, and when it was effective. Okay, so let's jump ahead and imagine that we put together this really comprehensive content within the policy and you have a great working draft. So what do we need to do next? Without question, it probably goes without saying that we need to do a really thorough review of the policy draft. And we're going to be looking for any errors in the content, spelling, or grammar, right? We also want to make sure that we are consistent with how we're referring to the program, right? If we call it the third-party risk management policy, we're going to want to call it the third-party risk management program, and we want to reference third parties versus vendors throughout the policy. We also want to review that the formatting is good and that it matches the format that is used by the organization. If you don't have a preferred format, make sure the one you're using is pretty clean and easy to read, that it has a great table of contents, and that any headers or footers are correct, and that footage numbers and pagination is consistent. Make sure that your fonts and font sizes look professional and consistent also. Once you have it in good shape, ask another person or two or three to read it and check for errors or obvious formatting issues. Don't underestimate how important these things are, right? Because a poorly formatted policy or one that's full of errors can really hurt your credibility and create unnecessary challenges and delays during the approval process. So I also want to emphasize the importance of feedback because we need to get that information up front and make the appropriate changes before we're looking for approval. So we need to think about the stakeholders. We want to, first of all, have our management look at it. If we have an executive sponsor, they should look at it. Let's pick a few lines of business to review it. We also think about those subject matter experts, right? Can they look at it and see if we're missing anything? Maybe it goes to the risk management committee. If your internal audit is willing to look at it, that is fantastic. And if you have those people in your organization that are known derailers, yes, have them look at it too. Some of the questions you need to ask your stakeholders is, does this make sense to you? Is anything missing? Can it be improved? What questions do you have? And is there anyone else you think should review the policy? Okay, for getting it approved, well, first and foremost, follow your organization's policy approval process. For some of you, that may take several layers of review. And for many organizations and per a lot of regulatory requirements, it's the board of directors that has to review and approve the final policy before it can be considered effective. So before anything goes to the board, make sure that draft has been reviewed, it's been approved by your management and any other required stakeholders. If you're doing an update to the policy, make sure you include a detailed change log that highlights any material changes and why you made the changes, and ensure all your policy version numbers are correct. Once that policy has been approved, before we distribute it, we want to formalize it by adding that approval date, who approved it, when it is effective, and the date of the next review. Also, please make sure you put the policy owner name, title, and contact information directly on the policy. If you have to distribute it, it's helpful to alert the stakeholders that a new policy is coming and provide a link or other way to access the policy. As a best practice, we want to review and update our policies if it's necessary, at least on an annual basis. We may have to do it more frequently if there's any material changes in our organization, like we have that big reorg, or we have some significant new or emerging risks, or there's been material regulatory changes or updates. Now, we're going to take our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our third and final poll question is, when it comes to developing or updating the third-party risk management policy at my organization, the biggest challenge is a lack of resources or time, understanding of risk and regulations, resistance to change or low support for third-party risk management, other, we don't have any challenges, or you're unsure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question that has come in from the audience.
Great.
And that question is, what should I do if policies aren't really enforced at my company?
This is a difficult one, and unfortunately, it's not terribly uncommon. One thing I do want to emphasize is the whole purpose of having that policy is to draw a clear line in the sand and communicate what the requirements and rules are. So if somebody doesn't follow those rules, requirements, and nobody acts on that, that can be a really big problem. And it's something that will get noted in an audit or regulatory exam. So if you're feeling like, policies aren't really enforced, or maybe they're not enforced consistently in your organization, I'd really start that conversation with your management and your risk committee, really emphasizing the importance of we need people to follow these rules, and if they don't, what's the penalty? If you don't have a risk committee, you could also try your compliance team. I think that they will understand the importance of having policies and stuff, since they basically have to be aware of all the regulations and requirements as well. So if, again, you're feeling like this is not going to be enforced, start that conversation with your manager, ask to talk to the risk committee or compliance team, and keep pushing in on it until you get some response. I hope that's helpful.
Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we have our third-party risk management policy template available for download in the related content widget. Be sure to check it out. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, let's finish up with some key takeaways, which we're going to start with. In the beginning, you need to understand how policies are developed and implemented at your organization, and you're going to need to use the right templates or formats. We want to make sure we're keeping processes and procedures out of our policies. We're going to put those in other documents. We need to make sure that we're using that direct and active language. Get away from the word shall. Be very clear. Use must, must not, should, may. Know your regulatory requirements and identify what is in scope for your policy, who has to follow it, and define your key terms. Always tell it like it is, right? No aspirational policies. We only say what it is that we actually do. Try and incorporate or follow that third-party risk management lifecycle, and keep a change log when you're making adjustments to existing policies. Make sure that all drafts are thoroughly reviewed and that you have gotten stakeholder feedback. And finally, make sure that the policy is accessible and available to everyone who needs it. And with that, we're going to wrap up. We're going to head back to Jessie for some more Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time and sharing some important information. On your screen now, you'll see our upcoming webinars. On February 6th, our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2024 webinar. And on February 15th, our Identifying the Key Players for Third-Party Risk Management at Your Credit Union webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Hillary, our next question is there a difference between third-party risk management and vendor management?
You know, that is a really great question. And in theory, there is not. There are some nuances there. When we talk about third parties, for example, as it relates to, say, the interagency guidance, they're talking about all business relationships, everything except your employees. And that is the case for many organizations. In other organizations that may not be regulated, we're really talking about vendors, service providers, suppliers, etc. Now, how you define it is completely up to you and your organization and what those regulatory requirements are. But in essence, all of the processes and the foundational requirements are still the same. So regardless of what you call it, just know that what we're talking about is in terms of the policy or that third-party risk management lifecycle applies to vendor risk management as well. I hope that helps.
Great. Our next question. What is the best practice in trying to move from FDIC regulated to OCC regulated as the bank size and portfolio grows into quote unquote big bank?
Well, there's probably a lot of considerations for that, but I'm going to narrow it down to our third-party risk management considerations. Now, one of the most interesting things is that there was a harmonized version of regulatory guidance that came out last year. It's that interagency guidance on third-party relationships. It makes the requirements and the expectations for banks of all sizes exactly the same. So my advice would be to read that guidance, map it against your current processes, and just determine if you have any gaps or insufficiencies, document them, and start getting a plan together to remediate them. But in essence, so for third-party risk management, there is no difference now on how you need to manage it or what the requirements are.
Great. Our next question. In your experience, which function owns the policy?
In my experience, and as a best practice, it's always the head of third-party risk management. Whoever serves that function should be the owner of the policy. Where they report, it's the CRO, maybe it's enterprise risk management. That's great, but we actually need an owner of that policy who can clearly speak to all of the requirements and activities that are listed in that policy. So as a best practice and a rule of thumb, that should be whoever is leading or has ownership for third-party risk management.
Okay, great. Our next question here. Do you recommend an organization produce a separate third-party risk management standards document that provides more detail than the third-party risk management policy document? Details such as procedures and internal categorization.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we didn't really cover this in today's webinar, but your policy is only one of your governance documents. And what you're referring to, we commonly refer to as a program document. Some people call it operating standards, playbook, whatever. That document is meant to really detail all the processes that are going to help you meet the requirements of the policy. You include things like RACI charts, approvals, maybe more details on your methodology, include all of like the third-party risk management lifecycle, et cetera. We also recommend that you do have separate procedures, which are the instructive how-to guides on how to fulfill those processes, like how to do an inherent risk assessment, how to upload a document. So yes, absolutely, you should have more documents than just your policy. Thanks for such a great question.
Great. We have time for a few more questions. And the next one is, do you need a separate policy for employees versus contingent workers to avoid any hint of co-employment?
This is a very interesting question. It has a lot of nuances to it. So the basic answer is no, you don't, because you're saying that this applies to anybody and everybody who does any work on behalf of the organization. Now, just before you are finalizing that, do check in with your HR department. Depending on your staffing models and other considerations, they may have questions or concerns. If you had to basically create a separate policy, you could just basically use the same policy and say this is for contractors or others. But in theory, no, it should cover anybody and everybody that engages or works with third parties on your behalf or on behalf of your customers.
Okay. Our next question. Should our policy include the calculations and formulas we use to calculate inherent risk?
No, that's too much information for your policy. That information is perfect for that program document I mentioned. And I do think that it is a good idea to actually document the methodology that is used, whether you use a weighted scoring table or other calculations. It is important to document them somewhere, but that is not necessary in the policy. I think what is necessary is to say that you do have an established methodology, that these are the levels of risk that are assigned, this is our inherent risk, et cetera, but don't put in all the calculations.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Our board doesn't approve our policies. Is that going to get us in trouble?
Not necessarily. It does depend on if you're regulated or not, and if your regulator requires. So, for example, for most financial services organizations, yes, that is a requirement. If you're not regulated or you're in a different structure, then while it's not necessarily going to get you in trouble, it is a recommended best practice. So if you don't have a board, you could have the most senior level of your management approve it. Alternatively, what I see a lot is a risk committee of the board. So it's not the actual board themselves, it's a designated committee that does that on their behalf. So the best way to really figure out if that's a requirement is to understand your regulations, and if you have questions, consult with your compliance team.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to creating a policy document. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we will get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.